your orientation
Yes.
implicitly guides and controls how you make sense of the world, how you form decisions, and how you act on those decisions. So conflict is everywhere. It's going on whether you like it or not. And if you don't orient yourself, someone's going to do it for you. And if your competitors are doing it for you, then you're in a lot of trouble.
Welcome to Strategy Meets Reality podcast. I'm your host, Mike Jones, and today I'm joined by Mark McGrath, Marine veteran, strategist, and one of the sharpest minds working with John Boyd's OODA Loop framework. We explore how orientation shapes strategy, leadership, and adaptation in an unpredictable world. From disruption and time to information overload and the guardians of decay, this is a conversation on thriving through challenge, not chasing control. And welcome back to Strategy Meets Reality podcast. It's great to have Mark McGrath today as my guest. Great to have you on the show, Mark.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Mike.
Cool. Just for our listeners, do you mind giving a bit of an intro about yourself and a bit of context of what you've been up to lately?
Yeah, sure. I live over across the pond. It's the first place you'd hit. Well, one of them, Manhattan. I live in Manhattan. I was a Marine officer, and then I spent just over 15 years on Wall Street in the asset management end of Wall Street as a external wholesaler. And I grew up a Army brat. My dad was a Army officer, so I lived all over the world. And then as a Marine officer, I lived all over the world. And what I figured out when I got out of the Marine Corps, I was an officer in the Marines for 6 years active duty. I was a field artillery officer. I learned really quickly in the civilian world that the Marine Corps had taught me a lot more than what the Marine Corps teaches, right? War fighting. That there were higher applications, that there were broader applications. And I started on this journey of just challenging everything that I had learned in the Marine Corps, knowing that what they taught me was really powerful. And I had this internal sort of bodily sense that there was a lot more to what they taught us. Like there was deeper stuff behind it. And it primarily focused and centered around the work of John Boyd, who was extremely influential to the Marine Corps, who I first learned of John Boyd when I was a midshipman in the Naval ROTC program, where I went to university at Marquette in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And our Marine officer instructor was a major, and he was talking about the Boyd cycle, OODA, the Boyd cycle. And we were learning about patterns of conflict. Now, this was in he was either late 94 or early 95, and actually Boyd was still alive. And, when you're a 19-year-old kid, it just goes over your head, and you learn it, and you learn how to take the test on it. But looking back to think that I was learning about Boyd when he was actually still alive for another 2 years, I wish I could go back in time and like go to find him and sit down with him. In a lot of ways, I feel like I have, and we can get into that. But anyway, I feel like what we learned was like how to do things, right? They were really good at telling us what to do. And being very contrarian and having been educated by Jesuits who love to question things and challenge authority and love open inquiry, I really started asking more and more questions, because if something was taught to me to thrive in the most adverse, chaotic, complex, friction-filled scenarios of, say, combat, why would it work? Why wouldn't it work anywhere else? And what I realized was that the Marine Corps taught us how to be really good complexity thinkers. They taught us how to be really good systems thinkers if we did the extra work and start to not just know it, but understand it. So I basically, I guess, dedicated my life. I started to do this as soon as I got out. Like I got out, and my first job before I went over to the capital markets world was in medical sales. And I just started realizing that things looked different to me than they did to everybody else.
Yeah.
And I wanted to know why.
That's good. Boyd's work is pivotal. And, just before we got onto the show, I think we were talking about, I don't think Boyd gets a lot of credit for the work and how he's influenced strategy. When I say strategy, I mean, not the orthodoxy of strategy that we're seeing at the moment, but, strategy that we know works in complex environments. So when you think about it in Boyd's work around orientation, that's a critical factor, but the whole thing gets sort of misunderstood. But I think in particular orientation. So why is that important? And also, where do people get wrong when they think about orientation?
Oh, this is great. So we're going to go to the big part first. We're going to go to the most
Yeah.
important part first, and then we'll fill in the rest. But so I came to the realization, and this is actually how I met Ponch, and how we sort of have become collaborative creative partners on working on these things. But I came to the conclusion that the way that they were teaching OODA loop was complete garbage, and
Mm,
that something else was going on. And as I would examine OODA loop's sketch, and this was especially when after Franzo Singa's book Science, Strategy, and War came out, which I highly recommend to everybody. You can see my copy. I've had it
oh yeah,
since it came out, and it is taped together and underlined like crazy. But I
that's a sign
realized
of a
that,
good book.
yeah, exactly. And it goes with me literally everywhere. Everywhere. I
Oh,
just was telling you, I just got back from Canada. Well, guess what went to Canada with me? That book goes with me everywhere. Orientation, I started thinking of it in a bigger context because, like, the more that you examine OODA loop's sketch, which is the only way Boyd ever illustrated the concept of OODA,
yeah.
you start to realize that orientation is not a phase. It's not a step. It's something, right? We could describe it a lot of ways, but the way that I mostly teach it is it's your cognitive operating system. It's how you make sense of your world
Mm,
and your reality. And your orientation is who you are, what you think, what you believe. It's your operating system, just like on a phone. You have an internal operating system that has to be updated and revised in order to stay relevant. The same thing with your mind. Your
yes.
cognition has to be updated. And what was the breakthrough for me was on the OODA loop sketch. Okay, I figured out what orientation was, and that had reminded of philosophical and theological and historical stuff that I had been taught in my university. My undergrad was in history, and my master's degree was in economics. I started realizing that, okay, that this all makes sense. Like, this is my essence, my being, and it shapes or implicitly guides and controls, as it says on the OODA loop sketch, how I makes sense, how I come up with decisions, how I act, and how I loop back and learn.
Mm,
And it all flows from orientation. So it hit me, and like I said, there were things along the way that helped. Osinga, the work of John Robb, the work of Chet Richards, and then
yes.
my collaboration with those two guys over the last several years, which has been crazy. It
We
hit
had
me that,
Chet on the show
yeah,
previously.
you've had Chet on. Yeah, he's been on ours 2 or 3 times. But what it made me realize was that I didn't know enough. There was more to Boyd than they taught us, and there was more
Yeah,
to war fighting than they taught us. And I really needed to go deep on it. And that's the realization. So when you read our work and you go on our Substack, you'll get the sense Ishin is the central component, and everything flows from that. And if you're
mm,
misoriented, the whole entire thing falls apart. Whereas some of the folks we were talking about that are teaching it in a linear way, as if it's a mathematical formula that can be applied anywhere objectively, it completely undermines the work that Boyd was doing around complexity, and it doesn't prepare you for the nonlinear reality that you deal with on a daily basis. So we're adamant about teaching orientation, and how your orientation implicitly guides and controls or shapes how you sense make, how you decide how you act, and how you learn. And once you get that, then you can really start to empower yourself and your team and those that you lead in a way that your competitors likely are not,
yeah.
they're likely not doing.
You see like a vast amount of work and energy being put in at the psychological level of assessing you to understand a bit of self-awareness.
Mm,
And that's an element, that internal understanding of yourself. But I think a lot of the time they're missing the adaptation, the reorientation that needs to happen with the external environment you're coupled with,
mm-hmm.
and how we can be shaped quite easily by predominant narratives, or if we're not careful about the information we're being fed, we can quite easily get misorientated or lose that connection with reality.
Yeah, it's totally, yeah, that's it. I mean, basically, in a competitive scenario, you're trying to disconnect your opponent's orientation from reality, so they lose
Mm.
their understanding of what's going on and what's happening. Where you had mentioned when we look at OODA loop linearly, I think that's what ended up happening is our orientation becomes completely disoriented, and that's how
Yeah.
we become subject to having the script written by somebody else, not us. We don't have our own sovereignty, our own actions, our own capacity for action. In fact, I was just playing today. You can look at our Substack. It's the world of reorientation, and the tagline had been clarity for complex systems. But then I thought, no, that's not powerful enough. What are we really empowering people to do? What are you empowering people to do when they understand orientation and they understand how orientation implicitly guides and controls how they deal with reality? Well, you're helping them escape the script, and you're helping them
Mm.
win the war, because the war's going on. Conflict is everywhere. It's going on whether you like it or not. And if you don't orient yourself, someone's going to do it for you. And if your competitors are doing it for you, then you're in a lot of trouble. Now,
Mm.
there's a flip to that. When you're orienting your competitors the way that you want them, then you're going to write the script for them and you're going to win the wars.
Yeah.
But that only comes, I think, with an effective understanding of what Boyd was actually what Boyd.
Yeah. You get this because we are coupled with the external environment, we're getting shaped by something.
Uh-huh.
And you can either, unconsciously, you can just go with it and you're going to be shaped, or you can try to reorientate and understand the nature of that relationship and think, how do I shape that relationship?
Uh-huh.
Um, but and that gets very much into strategy. So how is the idea of Boyd's work and orientation? How's that really important to strategy in your perspective?
Well, let's start with how he defines strategy, which you and I were talking about, and we put in the chat. He defines it as a mental tapestry of changing intentions for harmonizing and focusing our efforts as a basis of realizing some aim or purpose in an unfolding and often unforeseen world of many bewildering events and many contending interests. Most people don't think of
Wow.
strategy that way, right?
No,
That's
that's the
a
problem.
definition of strategy that says, okay, the world is nonlinear, the world is complex. We need to think about it differently than everybody else is doing, and how everybody else is doing, and certainly here predominantly in the Western world, they're thinking of it linearly, formulaically, objectively, like an engineer might, maybe a math
Yeah.
teacher. And we're going to take templates and solutions and we're going to put those on every situation we can find. And the world doesn't work like that. So if I
No.
have a strategy, my intent is going to change, right? Our intention changes as time advances. Why? Because everything's in a state of flux. Whatever
Yes.
whatever was is no longer, it no longer is anymore. It doesn't mean that we can't come together and coordinate action together. It doesn't mean that we can't come together and build widgets or whatever it is that we're doing for the world. But if our intention stays the same without changing or without having the ability to change, and if we can't harmonize around that and focus those efforts, in light of that change, that's how you become defeated. And that's really what he
Mm.
was saying a strategy is because we're going to evolve. How do we know that? Because things are going to evolve. I
Yeah.
hold up the iPhone earlier. Well, this is a very different iteration of this device from when it first came out 12 years ago.
Yeah.
It's changed a lot. I mean, I remember the first year the iPhone came out, I think it changed like 3 or 4 times, right?
Mm.
You're still communicating on it, you're still using it, but it's changing. It's
Yeah.
constantly in what's happened since. I mean, so many things have changed structurally, internally, externally, because everything's in a state of ceaseless flux.
Yeah. And just even on that, Apple are probably trying to reorientate now with the news or the unfolding, unforeseen circumstances that Sam Altman and Johnny Ives, the
Mm.
person that helped with the iPhone, have now combined. So that's the point to go, well, okay, now this is happening. What's unfolding? What's different or what could be different to what we're expecting?
So our orientation, as Boyd illustrated it in OODA Loop Sketch, would be our cultural traditions, our genetic heritage, our previous experience. So we would understand the fourth thing, new information, in light of
Mm.
those three things. And then the fifth thing is analysis and synthesis. How do we break things down? How do we build up something novel that didn't previously exist. And quite frankly, that's really the component of Boyd. I think that in addition to just orientation is not enough.
No, yeah.
Understanding the concept of analysis and synthesis, which is from his core paper, which I find that people teaching OODA have never read or even heard of in some cases, Destruction and Creation.
Creation.
If you haven't read it, if you don't know it and you don't understand it, you're not teaching OODA. You're teaching people linear formulas that are going to make them prey and targets for their competitors. But what Boyd is saying is that we have to be able to constantly destroy and reconstruct our mental understanding of the way the world is and the way the world
Yeah.
works, the way the market works or whatever it is. And if we don't do that, we're going to lose our capacity for free and independent action. And why? Three things. One was entropy.
Mm.
Two was uncertainty, and three was incompleteness, that things are always generating disorder and entropy. All systems, particularly closed systems, the world is uncertain. We can't fix 2 points between A to B, as Heisenberg taught. And then incompleteness. A system cannot verify its own efficacy within itself. In other words, we have to constantly be destroying our understanding and creating a new understanding, because nothing is certain, nothing is clear, nothing is ever complete, and nothing is ever escapable of entropy. Entropy is always going to be present. It's a matter of, if I open my system and I'm learning and I'm creating and destroying models effectively enough, then I'm not going to get consumed by entropy as fast as those that are closed.
Yeah. And you see that, Boyd talked about internal entropy. We create the um, bureaucratic nature that we spend too much time feeding internally, that we miss what's happening externally. We lose the ability to handle what's changing externally. And you see this where you're talking about some really good stuff about analysis and synthesis, about how do we destroy and recreate our own mental models, when the structure, especially around strategy, becomes such a bureaucratic thing that it becomes a cycle. It is an actual cycle of, right, we come to the end of the year, we need to get the latest financials done, the latest projections done, we need to go get it signed off by the board. What are we going to do next year or the next 5 years? Well, let's do what we did this year, but plus or minus 10%. It doesn't really give people the freedom to do what you're saying.
Yeah. I think it can be mitigated by having a good understanding of destruction and creation, and then expanding on that. So the trajectory, like when people ask me like, well, what's like the to get to the point where I'm at? I was like, well, the point that I'm at is I'm still in a constant state of learning, because one of Boyd's closest friends told me himself, and he would say this if we brought it. He's been on our show. His name's G.I. Wilson. He's a Marine officer.
Yeah, yeah.
And G.I. says, I first met the guy in 1979. I interacted with him virtually daily until he died in 1997. And ever since then, I'm still learning something new from him. I tell people, like, you don't just get Boyd and then that's it. You have to constantly keep getting Boyd so you can apply it. But anyway, what I was saying is that if you took the overarching trajectory, the way that I describe it, and this works for me, is like I have to start with destruction creation, and then I have to understand conceptual spiral, and then I have to understand the essence of winning and losing, which is where he drew the OODA loop sketch.
Yes, yeah.
And the other ones are important, yet they all kind of stay on that. They all kind of stay sort of, adjacent to that path or along that trajectory. So basically conceptual spiral builds on destruction creation, and then essence of winning and losing visualizes OODA loop sketch. Now that's also one of his smallest briefs, and people say, well, I'm just going to read that, because it summarizes everything. I say, good luck. And people read it like it's 5 pages long, and I have no idea what the hell it just said to me. And I said, you gotta break it down and do it the right way. I learned from, so Chuck Spinney was his closest collaborator, and I got a chance one time to spend like 3 or 4 hours on a call with him, which was insane. But Chuck has a thing called evolutionary epistemology. It's his understanding of destruction and creation. And when destruction and creation, it's only 11 pages or whatever, and it's dense. And I would read it and reread it and walk away saying, I have no idea what the hell Boyd is trying to trying to say? I mean, this all seems to make sense to me, but I don't understand destruction and creation. Well, evolutionary epistemology, I think, is sort of the codex, if you will, the Rosetta Stone, for me anyway, on how on what destruction and creation is actually telling us. And then once I got that, then conceptual spiral made even more sense. Then OODA
Yeah,
loop
yeah.
made even more sense. So that's an important. It's all over our Substack. I've cited that so many times. We actually put out from HLX. We put out a transcript of. I sent you the link. People
Yeah,
can
put
sign
that
up
on
for it.
the I'll put that on the show notes so
Yeah,
people can do that, and also link your Substack because there's a lot in your Substack that I think um, really gets to the heart of Boyd's work.
yeah,
And it's one of those things. Boyd's one of those ones. It's almost frustrating at a point because, like you said, you think you've got it, but then you haven't got it. And I think it took me a while to realize that I don't need to get it yet.
yeah,
I just need to carry on being curious and keep understanding it. And that the more that I apply not just Boyd's work, but when I more apply systems thinking, more apply complexity theory, more I toy with what really is strategy and pulling it apart, then I can go back to it and go, oh right, that makes sense because I've seen it. I've been involved in it.
yeah. I was gonna say too that when you read about his life, so the biography of Boyd by Robert Coram, you realize that Boyd, he didn't stop. He never thought that he got it.
Mm,
And this is why I never think that I get it.
yeah,
I always think that like he did, you have to keep destroying and revising your model, which is why he never really published anything because he thought, well, once I publish it, it's obsolete. I'm gonna
yeah,
have to go to
yeah,
get to the next thing. And he would call these guys his acolytes, many who we've had the privilege of collaborating directly with, like Chad or Chuck and G.I. Wilson. He would call them at 2 a.m. and say, "I've just had a breakthrough," and I'll listen to this, and he'd read something for like an hour, and then like the guy's on the other end of the line.
yeah.
But what he was doing was he was constantly challenging his assumptions. I had one yesterday. She was downstairs, but my soulmate Sarah would tell you, like, if you had heard me yesterday, I came to this like this just epiphany. I've a lot of my work has been as my master's as an economist, like overlaying Boyd with economics, and Boyd had a degree in economics, but trying to
Mm,
fuse the two things, specifically around the work of some very specific thinkers I talk about in the Substack a lot, like F.A. Hayek or whatever. But then yesterday, something just hit me like a ton of, like, it was standing in front of me for years, and then I had took one book that I was very familiar with, and you think you got it right, and then I was matching it up with something that Boyd was saying about time. That it was around, time as structure, not time as money, but time as structure. And then all of a sudden, it just started going like boom, 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 boom. Now I've had a master's in economics for many, many years. I've been reading this shit for many, many, many years. So, and then all of a sudden, it just goes click like that, and I was euphoric, but that
mm,
kind of stuff happens all the time. I think if you're doing what he said,
yeah,
because you're basically trying to arrive to a place of understanding, which ultimately hopefully gets you to wisdom. I don't think I'm at wisdom yet, but like I think I have a lot more understanding of Boyd and what he was trying to teach us. What exactly he was trying to teach us and what exactly he was thinking and feeling, which he took all the way to his deathbed, that's left for us to develop and find out. And I think that that's why when people present like a templated formulaic version of Boyd and his work, it's total garbage, and you should run, because it's training you to orient ineffectively. Because what Boyd saw something so much bigger and broader than what he's known for, and even on his deathbed, he was talking about evolutionary biology. So it's like, what do I keep doing? How do I keep building on this? And I think that that's really our challenge. And that's the intent of the podcast and the website and our professional work that we do with clients, that
yeah.
we're co-creating value, and we're co-learning. We're learning as much from them as they are from us. And I think that that's what Boyd is ultimately telling us to do.
Yeah, it fits well with his definition of strategy that unfolded and done unforeseen world. There's always going to be new developments. There's new connections to be made, and I think it right to put leaders in the more curious sense to try new things, to look to to have that courageous point to reorientate and to say, I don't really know, but I'm going to learn, try and find some information here, or try to learn. Where I think we sort of get stuck in this just formulaic thing
Mm.
that we look at something, we know it straight away, we apply it, and then that's it. We just keep applying it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. You double down. You,
Yeah.
you, you, um, you double down. I mean, people are really good at this because usually what they double down on is what they think they know,
Mm.
and they double down on what's comforting to them because they don't want to challenge their assumptions. They don't want to update their models. They don't want to revise. They don't want to think that they were ever wrong. And a lot of the thinkers that I'm attracted to, like Boyd, of course, Marshall McLuhan. I put an
Yes.
article out yesterday about Malcolm X, who would have been 100 this year. You know, these were
Yeah.
men
I
that
restucked it.
evolved. Yeah, they evolved. They changed their thinking. They came in contact with a new understanding. They got rid of the old and on with the new. That's destruction and creation. And I think that that's what most people don't like to do. And that's what people that actually do that, Boyd, McLuhan, F.A. Hayek, Malcolm X, you name it, Steve Jobs, they become off-putting. They become scary. They become an enfant terrible. Like they're like the radical child. That's just crazy. And he's always doing this. And we just wanted to just take it easy and just take it slow. But I think that those are the people that recognize that things are always changing and that you have to update. And I think that that's really important. That's what we have to do. And that's certainly what Boyd does. Do you ever see The Big Short?
Yes, I
The
did. Yeah,
movie
it's a really good. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Do you remember the opening quote? It's attributed to Mark Twain. I've seen Will Rogers sometimes, but it's like, it ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble. It's what you're absolutely sure of that turns out not to be true.
Yeah, it's true though. I'm
Totally.
just trying to find the quote that I'm not very good at Substack, so I'm trying to find the quote that you put with the Malcolm X thing, because I think that's really um really key.
Oh yeah, and those three quotes that I picked were by design because you can go through his again, this is what people think they know about Malcolm X, and then what they do or don't know about him. But sifting through his quotes, the three that I put up with the images, I love to make images for the articles.
Yeah.
But the three quotes that I found as you read them, they have nothing to do with race. They have nothing to do with religion. They have everything to do with time, improvement, like reorienting, things that Boyd would talk about. And it's kind of something else I say. Everybody's doing this, and people that are remarkable and memorable, like a Malcolm X, they're doing it well. And when you stop and you really examine why is it that we remember him, and why is it that if we decategorize him out of the boxes that everybody wants us to put him in, and we think about him in a different light, then we come to a new understanding, and then we come to the new understanding that opens up a lot of doors about other things that we may not have been aware of. And it isn't just limited to what the things that he was talking about. Like those concepts can break down barriers that we have in other disciplines or domains. And we say it all the time. And stuff that Boyd's talking about, it only applies where humans are present, which is everywhere.
Yeah, 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 yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
there's a really nice universal aspect to this stuff.
Yeah.
So
I think it's great. I couldn't find the quote I was looking at, but it was one that you had top of.
Malcolm X.
Yeah, that's
Well, there were
tell
there were
another.
two. One that he had about time, and one that he had about. So there's no better teacher than adversity. Every defeat, every heartbreak, every loss contains its own seed, its own lessons on how to improve your performance the next time. I mean, and that's
Mm.
that's Malcolm X. I mean, tell me that's not a John Boyd quote. I mean, that's perfect. Every
Yeah,
every
yeah.
lesson to improve your performance the next time. Well, that's what we're doing when we're constantly reorienting. The other one was in all our deeds, the proper value and respect for time determines success or failure. Time is radically misunderstood. I think Boyd does a really good
Mm.
job of helping us understanding time's structure and context. Marshall McLuhan does. The economists like Friedrich Hayek and Ludwig von Mises help us have a better understanding of time, because ultimately, what one of the applications, or one of the ways that we find with OODA, as time advances, it's time-based competition. Like we're constantly competing against time. And as Malcolm says, in all our deeds, the proper value and respect for time, I would say that includes the understanding of it, that determines our success or failure. I
Yeah.
think that's a pretty John Boydie.
Yeah, and you do see this. You do see this. I don't think there is respect for time. Um, Definitely when you look, and I look at a lot of strategy documents and
Mhm.
what people have put down as strategy, and time only really gets a play in to say that this is our vision for the next 5 years, or
Yeah.
this is this. I don't think it really takes into consideration about actually time and dynamics of time, uh, and what opportunities time does give, especially in not just in competition, but just in general with how things are moving around. There's certain opportunities that can be seized just by increasing your own cycle rate of
Mhm.
decision making or capabilities that you have. I think it's often
Well, and then like you saw, if you see the last quote that I had, it was power in defense of freedom is greater than power in behalf of tyranny and oppression. Now that's power, freedom, tyranny, oppression. Most people would say, yeah, that's what Malcolm X was talking about. But then listen to the rest of the quote. Because power, real power, comes from our conviction, which produces action, uncompromising action. Well, the power that's producing your conviction is your orientation. Your orientation
yes,
implicitly guides and controls how you make sense of the world, how you form decisions, and how you act on those decisions. So again, people that are doing it well. Now, whether I don't think that Malcolm X knew, clearly he couldn't have, because he is like sort of the proto example of this. Like he didn't know that he was applying Boyd's theories,
yeah, yeah,
or
yeah,
theories that Boyd would talk about, or certainly OODA loop sketch, which wouldn't be written till another 21 years, 31 years after his death, I guess. But what Boyd is observing and talking about are things that we're all doing, and people that are doing it well. Once they understand it, then that's where they
mm,
have the geometric results. That's what we tell. That's what we tell clients. I mean, you don't have to understand this, but if you don't and your competitors do, they're going to get geometric results on you, and you
yeah.
won't. You with them.
And that's how as a soldier we got taught Boyd, and probably the same as you. I think we got taught good insight into Boyd's work, but there's a lot more to it. We all associated it with the enemy and how do I get inside the OODA loop of my enemy,
Hmm.
and disorientate them, which is a fine example of what you could do, but there's definitely a lot more to it, and there's a lot more about yourself and your own ability to, like you said, reconstruct, construct, and your analysis and synthesis to have that conviction in your decision making, all stems from your orientation or how congruent you are with reality.
Yeah, that we influence. In the example you were describing, we can influence the enemy's orientation to get them to observe, decide, and act the way that we want them to. That's quote unquote operating inside the other person's OODA loop. And a really good place for people to also understand, they're not wrong when they say, well, read patterns of conflict. Boyd talks about a linear OODA loop. His original understanding of it, unevolved, was yeah, we observe, we orient, we decide, and we act. And then as he kept digging deeper, he realized that there's a supremacy of orientation. And when the orientation is supreme over another, that orientation is going to win. Well, what is that orientation doing differently than the other orientation? It's a lot more than just being faster. Because if
Yes.
you can be faster than your competitors in the wrong direction, and you've lost.
Yeah.
It won't matter. You could be number one at everything in every category, and then suddenly wake up the next day and you're completely obsolete. The Blockbuster example, it's still hard
Mm,
to find a better example, but they were number one in every single category around home entertainment across the board. And they were very
mm,
arrogant about it, and they were very comfortable about it, and they're very at ease with themselves. And Netflix gave them a pretty clear signal that they need to change and shift their orientation, and they didn't, and they were misoriented, and that's why nobody
yeah.
goes to Blockbuster anymore. We should
Yeah.
we
Yeah.
should talk about that. The mentor of mine from the Marine Corps said that there's 3 Ds that shift orientation, and the first one is drift. So my 49 self, passing 20 years, sees the world differently than my 29-year-old self. I mean, it's hard to believe
Yeah.
that it was
Yeah.
29, 20 years ago, but just drifting up time, because 20 years ago we didn't have iPhones and we didn't have whatever. And the second one and the third one are kind of what Boyd is talking about, Cheng and Chi, destroy, create, or whatever. It's disruption. So again, they all begin with D. So drift, then disruption and design. And if I disrupt your orientation and we're competing, then I want to meet that with design to channel you into whatever it is that I want to do, or if I'm trying to get you to stop using, product A and I want you to use my product, I have to disrupt your orientation and affinity to that product and meet it with my design. So it's like a constant balance of
Yeah, yeah,
disrupt design. But I thought that was a pretty good explanation.
yeah. I do really like that. I'm going to remember those. And that's a good thing. But it's also thinking about person themselves, that how willing is the leader, or group, willing to disrupt their own OODA loop, their own orientation. You see it with, like you said about blockbusters. They weren't willing to have their orientation disrupted, that there's a different way and there was going to be a different perspective, a different way to stream videos. They
Yeah.
just they were just then looking only for things to confirm their belief that what they were doing was going to be resolute all the way through this. And you see this a lot with businesses. They 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 definitely, if they've been doing well, suddenly that's it. I've done well. I've got money in the bank now. We've got structure. We've got that kudos that we wanted, that we've strived for, and it's almost as if their orientation is only holding on to that, and they would dismiss anything that would say otherwise. And then they get comfortable in that rut, and that drift happens slowly, but it's almost they guard against any narrative that's going to disrupt their own orientation.
That's the Guardians of Decay. If you
Yes,
if you
yeah,
if
yeah.
you've been reading my work, yeah, that's the guard. It exactly does that. It guards. They're the Guardians of Decay.
Mm.
They don't want to change. They want to defend the status quo. They want it the way it is. And if you're a board member at Blockbuster, or you're a senior level executive at Blockbuster, and you have a house, you have one on the beach, you have one on the beach in Florida, one on the beach up here on the shore in New Jersey, or you got one over there and you got an apartment in Manhattan, and I have a ski lodge up here, and I got great stock options and whatever. I don't want to upset that apple cart because I'm biased to my current situation. That's
Yeah,
a word we should talk about, is bias. And if
yeah,
there's that chart, that famous chart of like I think it's like 188 different cognitive biases that we have.
yeah.
All of
Massive
that
circle.
resides in your orientation. All of your
Mm.
biases reside inside your orientation. Well, confirmation bias is what you're talking about, or like surroundings bias or lifestyle bias or
Yeah,
whatever.
yeah.
That could have a direct impediment on how I see the world. Because remember,
Mm.
I'm filtering the world through my lens, my orientation. Bias is definitely um, a strong part of that.
Yeah.
So
I see this because we do a lot of work around strategy and org design. Things got to change because they
uh-huh.
change because, like you said, I don't know if you said it in the before we spoke at the start or during the show, but you're talking about your iPhone. Your iPhone asks you to update because the external environment's changing. So your iPhone then updates to be able to handle the changes. So we've got to. It's the same with our orientation. And I find this a lot, that we're trying to do things, and the bias for the status quo is so
Uh-huh.
strong that they'll dismiss it. And I understand it, because they like what their life is now, and they don't know what it will be beyond this change, because it's
Yeah.
unforeseen, it's unfolding, and it's trying to get them to realize that you've got to break down that orientation. You've got to, like you said earlier, you've got to be able to destroy that orientation to reconstruct something, because otherwise you are going to be shaped.
Yeah.
And it's far better in a situation to try and help shape it rather than to be shaped.
Somebody's going to write the script for you.
Mm.
And Netflix rewrote the script, and Blockbuster could only stand there and watch as they fell off a cliff. If you remember that story, I think that the CEO that they brought in ran 7-Eleven, which is a retail convenience store, and they wanted to capitalize on Blockbuster's retail store experience. They owned a lot of real estate too, so they're biased towards that. We're a
Yeah.
retail store. We have a lot of real estate. And I remember going to Blockbusters vividly. I mean, they had popcorn popping, and they had all these great movie posters and displays. And I think it may have been the first time I ever saw flat screen TV. Was like with like the advertisements of
Yeah, yeah.
movies and Blockbuster.
I used to love going Blockbusters.
Oh yeah, it was a great like
Yeah, it's
date night.
fun.
Like
Yeah.
let's meet a Blockbuster, pick a movie. Oh, they don't have what we have. Oh well, get the next one or whatever.
Mm.
But yeah, you can't even imagine. You can't even imagine. Like I don't know. Try to explain that to a 12-year-old today. Like they can't even fathom that. They're like,
Well,
what? And it really wasn't that long ago.
no, and it's like with my children. I got a 12 and 14-year-old, and I remember we were somewhere. I had to the old phone, where you dial it,
And
actually
they couldn't do
dial.
it.
No, they didn't understand it. They could
Yeah,
not work it out, and this is what blows your mind. You think about reorientation, that they haven't got that past experience
yeah.
to have that.
I'm trying to think of one lately was what were we talking about lately was when I was in college, I went down to Mardi Gras we would go down every year with the ROTC to do a drill team thing and march in a parade, and then we basically had 3 or 4 days to hang out and party at Mardi Gras. And I was going to meet a friend down there. Now this is in 1990, I don't know, 6. And you think about it, okay, I have to call her at her college before I leave my college and fly all the way down to Louisiana. I have to call her and say, I'm going to get down there and I'll find a place to meet or whatever. Then I call her mom collect and I say, hey, meet us at whatever at 1 o'clock. And then she knows or whatever. But and then I go there and I stand there with my buddy and we wait for like 2 hours and she never showed up. Well, she never made her flight. She missed her flight. And there's no way
Wow.
I would have known that. Like I'm down in New Orleans and she's flying from Chicago or whatever. Like how would I have ever known that somebody would have missed their flight in 1996? She had to call her mom in whatever state she was living in and tell her mom, who had to call my mom. Then I called my mom and I found out that she had missed her flight, right? But that was like normal business. Like that was
Yeah,
like
yeah,
normal.
yeah.
Now you think about it, you're like, well, I just would text, like, I missed
Just
my
text, yeah.
flight, or hey, I caught a later flight, or whatever. I'd know in like a second.
Yeah.
We were kind of joking at the beginning about 4th of July coming up, and that's the celebration of where I'm sitting right now in Manhattan is no longer a part of the United Kingdom.
Yeah, our king never went to visit you.
But think about this though. If I'm a British officer in Manhattan and I need to report back what's going on in Manhattan to London, how long would that time take for me to write it out, put it on a ship, send it over to, that's fast communication, right?
Yeah,
Look at us now. You're sitting there and I'm here. Like I'm in
yeah.
Manhattan and you're in UK. What are we doing? We're talking in real time, you know,
And
and
th-
you explain that to people and they just can't.
that's what led to the defeat of Napoleon in the end, because he was disconnected and he wanted information to make decisions that were happening in Spain, I believe. But this is right, and you're thinking around, we're talking around our own mental models and how they've been disrupted and how they've evolved over time.
Mm-hmm.
You think that generation from sort of early 2000s to now is probably being a huge disruption.
Well, this is where one of the things I think that really differentiates our work is this is when we start talking about Marshall McLuhan. I started to understand McLuhan more than, he's known for the term the medium is the message, just like Boyd
Yeah,
is the OODA loop, and then you stop there and there's, you're not supposed to look at anything else. Well, when you dig into McLuhan, you realize that medium is the message. He's not just talking about media, like the media, like the news, or social media or film or whatever. He just defines media as all technology and all environment. And medium is just a plural of the Latin word media, right? So our devices and tech and our phones and everything, all of that is the message, not so much the content of what we're talking about, because what he says is that medium are extensions of us. And if you notice what we talk a lot about lately around the 5T protocol and fifth generation warfare, we use McLuhan's quote, and John Robb was the first one that I saw use this in a piece that he had called McLuhan on War. Marshall McLuhan said in 1968 that World War III is, not will be, is a guerrilla information war where there's no distinction between military and civilian participation. And he was saying this stuff because of the amalgamation and the pervasiveness of electronic media. Now, think of electronic media in our day versus his day, and he was able to see
Yeah.
this, crystal clear. But what he said about electric media is interesting. Electronic media, like we're using right now, those are extensions of all technology is an extension of a human function or human sense. Electronic media is an extension of our central nervous system. So when you think about all the garbage that's out there and how you were talking about how people are getting oriented by, it could be news or bias or whatever, all that's directly affecting your nervous system physiologically. That's insane.
Yeah.
And that's so what I started realizing is that, and I said I followed off of what John Robb showed, because John Robb, he's a guy you should get on the show. I mean, you talk about a guy that
Yeah.
knows Boyd. I never thought of applying McLuhan that way, but Boyd even says it on his OODA loop sketch, unfolding circumstances within our environment. Well, that's the medium. That's the
Yeah.
medium. That's the medium is the message.
Mm.
And that
And
has
it,
a direct impact. So the technology that say our a 12-year-old has versus a 49-year-old, the understanding, orientation, Boyd, but then the effect of what that has, McLuhan. There's a synergy of those theories that I think bring us to different understanding.
yeah, yeah, it's going to affect you because, especially now with the information, just as your story with your friend that you could meet, the pace of the messaging and stuff back then was a lot slower
Mm-hmm.
and a lot less, where it's increased. And there's always, I never look dystopian at things. There's always benefits and there's always issues with the stuff. But you think about affecting your nervous system or your beliefs, your ability to synthesize that stuff
Mm-hmm.
tainted by what you're getting. And you see this a lot with leaders when you're trying to do stuff. You haven't got to go far. You need to go on LinkedIn and it's like a doomsday story. Oh, it's all going, the future of work is doom and gloom. All this stuff is doom and gloom. We must do all this stuff. And you wonder how much this is sort of penetrating leaders' minds and starting to shape their orientation into more a dystopian view, which causes a unhelpful perspective
Mm.
on what's happening.
Yeah, I also think too that the more you get into this stuff, you realize that even the smallest actions can have the biggest effects
Mm.
throughout time in history. Even like small, like you're talking about, like Napoleon wasn't able to make a decision or made a wrong decision, and it just came down to one thing. The impact of that, it's just exponential beyond. Back to my example, I could joke about it now. It's so long ago, but well, that's why I never married that woman, because like we weren't able to connect in New Orleans, and whatever. But really, when you think about it, like those sorts of things where like a messenger's car broke down, or I don't know, the power went out or whatever. It's not so much as simple as something happened, now we got to fix it. It's something happened, and whether it gets fixed or not, or how long it takes or whatever, there's a whole chain of events that's going to perpetuate throughout time because of that action. It's not insignificant.
And that's the thing. When you look back on Boyd's quote about strategy, which I love, is that um, you're realizing your aim and purpose and unfolding often unforeseen um, world. And
Yeah.
it's that thing that we don't necessarily understand, that us doing this action will have this effect. And that's where the observation needs to happen to ensure that when this is happening, we're not just looking at the surface level thing of we've done this and what we need to fix, but it's also looking at, well, what's happening there, and now that's happened, who else might be interested, or who else may act, or how would they act, and how would we know they're acting?
Yeah. I had a thought on that, and it just escaped my mind as quick as it came in. But oh, I know. So I mean, ultimately, what you're talking about, I think lines exactly up with Boyd, that OODA loop sketch is just a illustrative abstraction of how we learn as humans.
Mm.
And if we don't learn effectively, if our ability to understand, in other words, our ability to orient is not aligned with reality or is not harmonized with reality in our environment, which is always changing, then that's how we become obsolete. That's how we become defeated. We can't
Yeah.
adapt. I can't adapt unless I'm learning.
Yes.
If I'm able to learn, then I'm able to adapt. We tell people all the time, I mean, the better you get at this, that's how you thrive. It's one
Yeah.
thing, our natural instinct as humans to survive. That's one thing. We have to adapt in order to survive. But you also have to accelerate that and have a deeper understanding of that in order to thrive.
Mm.
And people aren't hiring us to survive. If they're hiring us to survive, it's likely too late because what got them there in the first place. We're likely not going to be able to get them undone. But people
Yeah.
that are very successful and they're stuck, or people have done really well, but they're just not getting to the next level, or they're in sort of a recapitulation phase, like they've gone up, now they're like plateauing. You know, if they're willing to take the time and understand how it works, then they can be very successful. Then they can learn how to thrive because they've already
Yeah.
done it at some point. Anybody successful is already doing this or has done this. It's when they take the time to really learn what's behind it and how it all works. And I think that that's where
Yeah.
they get really good at it.
And it's quite easy to see organizations that are just happy to survive.
Hmm.
And you see this by what they do, the artifacts that they produce. They're the ones that will produce these lovely purpose statements and stuff and sound. They're all very performative. It's all
Yeah, that's the
performance,
Guardians of
branding.
Decay.
Yeah, yeah. But those ones you can easily tell that the ones that are wanting to adapt because they're more curious, they want to learn.
Hmm.
They are trying to see, they're not fundamentally trying to change themselves. They're trying to keep coherent but adapt within that.
Hmm.
And there's a huge difference. And they're the ones that aren't so much bothered around performative stuff. They're really interested in the maneuvers they have to do and are willing to accept the structural changes that need to happen to enable them to adapt
Yeah,
and try to do it quicker.
I think from an organization standpoint, we're talking about Guardians of Decay. There's a quote that I came up with that I've been playing with, and it does have a foul word, so I'll just say effed. But there's nothing more false, fragile, and effed than an individual idea or institution that believes itself beyond intellectual scrutiny, because the moment it rejects inquiry, it begins to rot from within. And it's sort of a guardian of decay law, I suppose. But I think it hits on what you're talking about. These organizations that don't take the time to learn or whatever, then they're going to hit those three F's,
Mm,
false, fragile, and effed. Um, because their competitors, if they're doing the stuff that we're talking about well, they're going to smell blood in the
yeah.
water. They're going to see that it's like walking around with a giant bullseye. It's just like come and compete with me and clean my clock because I don't know what I'm doing. We're only doing system is perpetuating itself. We have no idea where it's going. It has no soul. It has no direction. It has
Yeah.
no focus. Do you know the story? His name was Nick Leeson, the rogue trader for Barings Bank.
Yes. Yeah. 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 You got jail, didn't
Yeah.
you, for a long time?
I have a different, and I've said this on podcasts before, but I kind of have a different take on that. So yeah, I broke the rules or the law, or whatever, but my suspicion always has been that an institution, organization like Barings Bank that had been around for 400 years or whatever it was, that this guy didn't just by his actions as a rogue trader ruin a perfectly healthy, well-oriented company that was cycling through John Boyd's OODA loop sketch better than their competitors. I don't believe that. I believe that he probably lit a fuse inside something that had already been systematically rotting over
Yeah.
generations by entropy and apathy and bias and guardians of decay and people, and all it needed was a guy like that to do something what he did. I'm not apologizing or saying what he did was right because it wasn't, but all it needed was just like a
Like a little.
catalyst.
Yeah. It was a tinderbox, and he
Yeah,
was
that's what I'm,
the
that's my
the mat.
suspicion is that
Yeah. Well,
if you did an organizational study, that would be my guess. And
I think.
why? Because of the patterns of organizations like that.
Yeah. But when things go wrong like that, and in organisations, people go on and they go, "Well, the report's always the same. They had a culture of this."
Mm.
But I think what you're getting at with the Guardians of Decay, and I think external to organizations is a bit more nefarious, but in organizations, you see it because it's performative. They
Yeah.
have this narrative that they want to put out, and they've got the best internal branding teams. They put this stuff out, the narrative that we're doing this, and they they put down any sort of dissent to that. So anything that is slightly descending to that, saying that actually this is my experience in this role,
Hmm.
that gets shut down. And they almost, I've seen it in organizations, they get people to go, well, we want to see this thing is happening. So it's almost stage managed.
Yeah.
People are going around doing stage photos that, oh, look, we're doing what you said we were going to do.
Totally performative. So that goes back to that example that we were talking before we came on line, is that, when we're in competitive situations in a group like ours, that's a small, deployable, decentralized, adaptive team that's going to help you sustain and build change from within internally, is so much different than some New York Times bestseller that comes and drops off their book, gives a keynote speech and takes a bunch of pictures with people and then leaves. I think that's the difference. That's just performative. See, we did this. We handed everybody this book,
Yeah.
uh, effectively applying it was never on the cards. We just needed somebody to come in and entertain us, and we had $100,000 in the budget. One of the things that I put in the chat just now, you can share with your audience. It's a transcript of Patterns of Conflict. It's 170 pages, and it's one of the better ones. And it's John Boyd interacting with Marine officers at the Command and Staff College in Quantico in the late 80s. One of the guys there is Colonel Mike Wiley, who was the guy that ultimately brought Boyd into the Marine Corps. One of the voices, I'm positive, and there's no confirmation, but is General Paul Van Riper, who's famous from Millennium Challenge 2002. If you look that up, I just know his voice so well. I'm positive it's him. But anyway, Boyd talks a lot about in those books or in that transcript about certain books by a guy called Andrew Krapenovich that wrote a book called The Army in Vietnam. And one of the things that he talked about in that transcript was about how, well, we come to these lessons learned and we're going to redo things, but all we ended up doing is just slapping a new coat of paint on something,
Yeah.
the same old stuff, without even trying. We're never going to employ a radical like a John Boyd to really fundamentally change things so that we can not only survive but thrive. We're just going to get together. We're going to find scapegoats, like he talks about in there, how, we're going to blame the media, we're going to blame the hippies, or we're going to blame whatever for our failure in Vietnam. We're never in a million years going to say it was effective applications of guerrilla warfare and Sun Tzu that, in our over-reliance on technology, we didn't do the things that Boyd talked about, people, ideas, things. They're never going to say that. So you get a bunch of scapegoats. You have a blue ribbon panel, like a blue ribbon commission to go in and
Yeah.
investigate, and they're going to slap a new coat on things, but nothing fundamentally changes.
No. And that's where we think about the law of sufficient complexity, is that if you want to emerge new behavior, you need to change structurally sufficient enough to emerge that new behavior. You
See
can't.
there. So yeah, that's what Ponch always says, is systems drive behavior. And
Yeah.
that's another way. What you just said is just another way of Marshall McLuhan. The medium is the message. So the environment and the technology are going to drive the behavior, because those have an effect on the human sensing.
Mm.
Those are the extensions of the human. So if we build the environment that way, why would we be shocked when we get crap results? Like,
Yeah.
why is anybody ever shocked? Yet they always are. And
Yeah. And
but
that's the
that's the first
performative.
mover advantage, though. I think that Boyd's trying to get people to break out of. And when you break out of that script, you become pretty powerful and pretty
Yeah.
lethal.
And that's the performative nature that you see people do. They bring stuff in that looks good, and but it only focuses on behavioral, like a belief system that's not supported by anything, and they wonder
Yeah.
why then it sort of just disappears.
Yep.
That's good. But I've really enjoyed the conversation. So, what would you like to leave our listeners with to think about from this podcast?
I would have them take a look at our article that I put out today, John Boyd 101, and they could
Yeah.
start there. And basically, Brett McKay and Kate McKay, that keep the blog The Art of Manliness, and they have a Substack called The Dying Breed. They created articles in 2014 which were baseline Boyd. So he one's called the Tao of Boyd, and the other one's called John Boyd's Roll Call. And for people ask me all the time, they say, "Well, I don't know anything about John Boyd. Where do I start?" And I'd say start with Brett McKay, or start with The Art of Manliness, Brett McKay and Kate McKay, and the article The Tao of Boyd, which explains who Boyd was and what he thought, and then Boyd's Roll Call, which is his famous to do or to be speech, and that's ultimately what we're trying to do, not be, and we're trying to get people to sort of follow that fork in the road.
Yeah.
So that's probably a really good place to start.
Awesome.
We are going to ramp up our podcasting. We've kind of taken a couple weeks where we've just been not putting out as much podcast content as we have written content on the Substack, but we have more podcasts coming out. But yeah, I would start there at the Substack, the world.substack.com.
Thank you for joining me. I've thoroughly enjoyed this, and I hope people are starting to get to grips or starting to understand the importance of Boyd's work and how it can really help deal with strategy, especially in this changing world. How do we get strategy that meets reality? And if you've liked this podcast, please share amongst your network, and please follow Mark's work. It's fantastic, especially in the Substack. But again, thank you, Mark, for joining me. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thanks for having me, Mike.
Cheers, pal. See you in a bit.